I'm going mute now. We'll see you all after the show, so looking forward.
Hello, everyone. We would like to welcome you as you join us for our explorations at the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. I'm Rachel Schaff of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, now in its 26th year. Our festival theme this year is Polyphonies. We acknowledge that we are mounting this festival and convening our communities together for a conversation within context beyond Ithaca. We ask you to remember that the 2023 festival takes place as global climate catastrophe intensifies, as the Russian war in Ukraine continues, as polarizations about race, gender, sexualities, nations, politics, land, air, and water deepen across the globe, and as people across the world endure violence and disease, yet continue to fight for our democracy, equality, freedom of expression, and a livable planet. Ithaca is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and acknowledge the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. At the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, the world is our why.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leah Schaefer, an associate producer at FLEF. Major sponsors for FLEF include the Park Foundation and Ithaca College. We are all very honored that you have joined us today for this event. Our event will begin with the speakers who are going to give a presentation about their fascinating project. Then we will have a moderated Q&A, and then we will open the floor to your questions. When we get to the moment when it's time for your questions, we ask you to use the Zoom raise hand feature, which you can access by clicking the reactions smiley face at the bottom of your screen. When you raise your hand, we will bring you into our conversation. It is with great pleasure that I now introduce today's speakers. Jennifer Jenkins is Principal Investigator of Tribesourcing Southwest Film. Melissa Dahlman is the Digital Projects Manager and Archivist for Tribesourcing Southwest Film. Rhiannon Sorrell is the Narration Coordinator for Tribesourcing Southwest Film. Rhiannon is Digital Services Librarian and Assistant Professor at Diné College in Saley, Arizona on the Navajo Nation. Our moderator today is Associate Teaching Professor of Film and New Media and Curator of Film and New Media at NYU Abu Dhabi. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Leah. We're so happy to be here. Thanks to FLEF and Ithaca College in the heart of Central New York, Indian Country. I'm coming to you from Tucson, Arizona on the US-Mexico border. And I want to note that Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes and at least 6 ancestral cultures, some of whom we will be talking about today. So what we're going to do is talk about, because we're not a film, we're a project, we're going to talk a little bit about this project and show you some methodological or nuts and bolts pieces of how we put the project together and end up with some clips of how it works. So this project began with a call for a stewardship of a bunch of films that had been collected by a professor at Northern Illinois University. And he went around at the point at which libraries and schools were getting rid of their films and switching over to this great new medium, VHS. And he started collecting these films, which were largely going into dumpsters. Nobody really wanted them. So he said, I'll take them home. He did. He rented a warehouse in Chicago and started filling it with these cans of 16mm films. And he collected broadly across all kinds of interest groups. These are basically social studies films that people would have seen up until the age of video in classrooms, in public schools all across the country. And so one portion of that collection was films about Indigenous peoples of the Americas. And when he got ready to retire, he looked for a home for this collection. And I wrote a proposal over a 4th of July weekend, and we were gifted the collection. The physical films actually reside at the Library of Congress, and we have the digital assets here at the University of Arizona. So they came to us. He had already scanned all of the films, and so they came to us as digital assets, but they were unmediated, so to speak. They were just plain scans that were done on a very early generation Elmo. So they looked like somebody sort of scanned them in their garage, which is about what happened. And so we put them up, rescanned them for Flash, which is no longer supported, put them up on a website, and then realized that the content of these films was really, in many ways, something that needed intervention. These films were made in the golden age of 16mm filmmaking, and they are gorgeous Kodachrome films with beautiful imagery, but the narrations are really, in many cases, just appalling. You know, they come from the period after World War II and the 50s and into the mid-60s, and express ideas that may have been mainstream, but were certainly not appropriate then or now. So our idea was to address those narrations by finding corrections. And at about that time, I put out a call for an intern, and Rhiannon applied and became part of the project. And she was my very first project intern. And what she did was engage with one of the films about the Diné culture, the Navajo culture, and record a counter narration. And through the process of doing this, we worked out some protocols for that action, and also came up with the term tribesourcing. So it's a little bit like crowdsourcing. It's not a fundraising activity, it's an information raising activity. And tribesourcing means basically that the responsibility for information returns to the communities that are represented in the films, rather than resting with external narrators. So we record narrations from within the communities and overlay them on the existing digitally scanned video. And that's where Melissa has come in to the project. So we were very lucky to get funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I say to all you US taxpayers, thank you so much, to build the site to begin with. And Melissa was instrumental in that. And then we were actually able to get a second round of funding to continue the project. Our first round focused largely on the peoples closest to my location, which is in southern Arizona, and the Tohono O'odham and the Diné and the Apache people. And then the second round of funding is focused on moving eastward into New Mexico, the Rio Grande Pueblos, and the Hopi people in eastern Arizona. So I just want to say a few more things and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues. The whole project is guided by the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, which is a document largely born out of the NAGPRA period, dealing with material culture and returning material culture to the peoples to whom it rightly belongs. However, image sovereignty is a really big issue in Indian country, as you might guess. And so we are guided by the principles of the protocols and extend them to moving and still image culture. The basic principle of the protocols is consult. Never make decisions for the people. Always, always consult the community engaged and ask what they want to do with the material. And so with some of these films, for example, they captured things that really shouldn't have been captured on film. And so if the communities don't want the films to be part of this collection, they say so, and we take them down. There are things that shouldn't be seen at certain times of year or shouldn't be seen by certain members of a community who might not be initiated or are barred from seeing information due to gender or age restrictions or clan restrictions. So, the protocols are a really useful document and they guide pretty much everything that we do. I'm going to turn it over to Rhiannon to talk a little bit about the process of narrating, what the first narration was like. You can talk about that a little bit maybe, and then talk about collecting or encouraging other folks to do narration. I have a comparative example just before I turn it over to you. And Melissa, if you could pull up that slide, that'd be great. I just want to share with the audience what we started with and how we dealt with it. This is a little, and you'll see a clip of this at the end, a live clip, if you will. Okay, so this is from a film called Arts and Crafts of the Southwest Indians, the Navajo. And it begins with this kind of original voice of God. Could you go back, please? Thank you. Narration. Where the narrator, who is, middle-aged, middle American, white guy. So we refer to that as the voice of God narrator. Speaks with authority about things he knows nothing about. So once a proud nation of hunters and warriors, now the poorest of the Southwest Indians, the Navajo people live in a barren and arid reservation of 1,000 square miles. Most of the land is in Arizona and New Mexico. They are still a nomadic people, frequently moving from place to place on their vast reservation, wherever their small herd of sheep and goats will find grazing land and be fairly near one of the scarce water holes or springs. Their herds are the Navajo's livelihood. They drink the goat milk, and sheep and goats provide all their meat. Their women make rugs and blankets from the wool. The trading post is the Navajo's only link with the outside world. The trader, his best friend. So this is an anonymous, voice of God proclaiming this information. And if we could see the next slide, please. Mm-hmm. There we go. So then when Rhiannon comes in, she begins with native language use, a greeting in Dinesh Bizad, the Navajo language. This is Rhiannon, so it feels weird to read this out when she's sitting right here, but we're going to hear her later. But anyway, she names herself. She says where she is. She's female. She's from within the culture. And she talks about how the title is a little misleading because it makes the trades in the film sound like recreational pastimes rather than a way of life that has sustained the Dinesh since the early 20th century. And then she says, as you can see from these opening scenes, the Diné were not village dwelling and lived in small bands spaced apart from each other, often far away from the nearest town. And this is where the trading post came in hand. And so then she identifies where that trading post is, a specific location. And later, as the narration goes on, she identifies specific people who are seen on screen, which is almost never the case in these post-war educational films. So we know that it's Pine Springs, and she tells what trading posts do, right? Not that they're the best friend of the local people, but that it functions like a grocery store, an arts and crafts store, a bank, a post office, and sometimes family court, and even as a mortuary. So you can imagine, and you'll hear this later in our presentation, but you can imagine the contrast, right? And that's really the point, is to take back the images and supply a narration that is informed, it's culturally knowledgeable, and it's based in place and location and culture that is specific to the people who are represented in the films. Now, this narration, this first counter narration, is in English, but we do have some in Indigenous languages as well. So that is a function that I think is an important part of this project in terms of polyphony, in that we have narrations on the project that Melissa and I don't understand. We're not speakers of Diné Bizad. And there's one in Atam that Rhiannon can't understand. So, and that's okay, because we don't own these things. They belong to the people represented in them. And that polyvocality or polyphony is really, in many ways, the essence of the project. And one of the reasons we're so excited to be included in this festival this year. So I will hand it over to Rhiannon, who can tell us about your part of this and all the fun experiences you've had.
Yeah, Jennifer, thank you so much. Yat a amstwashe Rhiannon Sorrel initiate chini nishvendel tanestani a bashin twehegrini dasha chedo na kaine dasha nava je consehili de kehest. Good afternoon, morning, I'm not sure, depending where you are, or evening with Dale. My name is Rhiannon. I am the coordinator for narration here at the Diné region of films. And I've been involved with this project since it was the American Indian Film Gallery, primarily based out of the University of Arizona. And I always credit Jennifer with being one of the first people to kind of bring me back home, since I was a graduate student at the University of Rhode Island. And there was definitely not an emphasis on these Indigenous projects. There was not a whole lot of emphasis on examining items like the protocols, and definitely not a whole lot of activity that I could really get involved in. So being able to do this virtually with her was one step in bringing me back to my home communities, where I'm currently based, and where I really got involved with this particular aspect of the project. So when I first started the narration process, I did come out of it a little like it was a demo. It was a bit intimidating, because on one hand, I noticed a lot of things that were in the video, things that have been very familiar to me, such as the cultural arts, particularly in weaving, because both my grandmothers, my maternal and paternal grandmothers, were both weavers. And I have a background in creative nonfiction. So I always talked about non-traditional modes of expression in nonfiction, memoir, autobiography. And I was thinking, like, these are my grandmother's autobiographies. This was their way of expressing themselves. And so it was really important to me to communicate about what all of this meant, especially with regard to this belittling aspect of saying, oh, it's just arts and crafts. I'm like, it's more than that to us. And so it gave me an opportunity to speak back to that. But at the same time, there's a little bit of an aspect of I'm not from the Pine Springs community. I'm not from the Southern Arizona, Southern Navajo community. So I could only speak so much about that area. So when I got involved with the project, it became a matter of reaching out to those people that definitely knew more than me with regard to the subject matter, the places, the activities, the people in the film. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So a lot of these people, it's not just with regard to just straight up facts like locations, people, and activities. Embedded within a lot of these, again, is traditional knowledge. I had a little bit of traditional knowledge that I would carry with me from my grandmother's weavings, but there's so many more. A lot of it is place-based knowledge, meaning it really belongs to the people, the geographies, it's connected to those places. And if you're not from those places, then a lot of times you don't really have any business sharing some of it. So it became really important for me to reach out to those who definitely knew more than me, who definitely were practicing weavers, those who were actually from those communities, those that have trained within those ceremonies that were depicted, those that knew the people in there and had those stories that are passed down to them. So, and I didn't feel like it was my place to really always, keep speaking for them. So that's where I became like the liaison, the one to reach out to everybody and to start recruiting people to talk about these films. And so that process started small. I began here at Diné College. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We have a number of partners that we started with that already had these goals in mind, whose jobs is to educate, not just the outside. The Institute works very closely with the Navajo Nation IRB, and they work about research, people communicating research that's going within the Navajo Nation to the outside and vice versa. So they know what it's like to have to talk about some of these materials, especially with regard to traditional knowledge. Another big partner was the Navajo Cultural Arts Program. And for them, they also talk about how cultural arts is not just a hobby, it's not just a pastime, it's a way of life. And it's deeply ingrained into the language, the culture, the state of mind of the artist, and so forth. And their big mission was the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So for them, it was an opportunity to educate people within the community, just as they do with the moccasin making, with weaving and silversmithing, basket making, and so forth. Same with the School of Diné Studies and Education. They are based in Navajo language. They were particularly interested in how these films could be used within the classroom as well. So I started small within the community and worked my way out and finding these initial partners. And it was really great because one of our first narrators actually did come from the Diné Policy Institute, who was Michael Parrish. And I remember his initial response was very like, I just have to say something. I can't stand this audio. And that was kind of the way I started like getting people interested, was showing the films and then cutting out the audio, because people would pay attention. As soon as they see the films, it would really be captivating, and they would start telling stories or saying like, I know that area. Oh, do those people still live there? I don't think they live there anymore. Their hogan is still there though. And they start telling these stories. But sometimes then he threw in the audio, and then you can see them kind of cringe and be like, oh my gosh. And Michael was one of my very first narrators who was just like, I have to say something. They're talking about these areas and both the tribal council chambers that just don't make any sense. And then they're talking about my hometown, which was Monument Valley. And I really got to say something about this. And so starting off with that, it became again about correcting the record. But as I started moving further out into the community, I worked with people who are former employees. One of my colleagues here, she's a clan member of mine. She's considered my grandmother. She and her husband did the very first all Navajo language narration. So when I reached out to them, they were like, okay. And they just like started speaking Navajo. I was like, nope, we're just going to use Navajo. That's what we're most comfortable with. And so that's what we moved into, kind of forming this idea of how to approach this project. Next slide, please. So we did our narration here right at the Kia'ani Library at Diné College in our R.C. Gorman room here. It's a little small location. The library is considered the center of our college. Our college is actually a geographic circle representing the traditional Navajo Hogan, and the library is considered the center, which is the fireplace, and that's where everybody's like, oh, just go to the center of the circle, that's where the library is. So it was easy to get in contact and meet up with people at the library to do these narrations, and they were all day things. These were things where it was like, okay, I gotta meet my narrators, we gotta set up. We had my laptop, they had an iPad for which they were actually listening and watching the films. I remember Cindy and Perry coming in, they both had their sets of headphones and they would be sitting there with their iPads listening and watching, and then they would take a while, maybe a day or two, to like think about it, and then they would just come and they say like, we're ready, and we just sit down at that table there and start the recording. As the film's playing, we just mute it and they just start talking. And it was there too where I had a lot of conversations with other narrators too, talking about how they would approach the project, because I had mine as a demo, but when mine was playing, it kind of just is more speaking to people who are not familiar with the Diné or with cultural arts and so forth. But once we got the narrators in, they were like, well, what do you want me to do? And I'm like, whatever you want to do. The point there was to really try not to direct and guide, push them to go in any particular direction. And because of that, it organically built the direction that they wanted to go. Next slide, please. And so, actually, go back. I'm so sorry. I thought I had another slide there. So one of the things, the most interesting things I can point out about these conversations was, rather than anyone, these films started off with the outsider speaking to other outsiders. And then they started to kind of take in the form of insiders speaking to outsiders. But little by little, as we had more narrators, they found it more comfortable and it made more sense to them to talk about the films and narrate them as if they were talking to their children, their grandchildren, their students, other Navajo language learners. So it became people from within the culture, within the tribe, within geographic location, teaching others, informing others, wanting to speak to them. So it became a way to reclaim these films, and it became a big conversation of like, what do we want for these? We just wanted to continue using it to educate outsiders about ourselves, or do we want to use it to educate our children and our grandchildren, both in Navajo language, but also being like, this particular area is important and this is relevant to our family. It became family history. It became, again, with the cultural arts program, educational tool to be like, this is how they used to do this particular technique back in the 1960s. And now we have these modern tools that we use this here, but some of the old people, they say this is a better way. It became an educational tool. So it became placed back into the culture, being placed geographically back within our homelands. So that's one thing I really, really appreciate about getting out of this and working with our narrators. But one last thing I want to touch on is the after narration. So one of the most important things when working with Native communities and Indigenous communities is, and this is very integral to the protocols, is incorporating and living the 4 R's, which are keystones in Indigenous research methods. And they stand for respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationality. When you're talking about that, with you're working with Native communities, as soon as your research is done, as soon as your interviews are done, as soon as the work is done, it doesn't mean the relationship ends there. There's a continued relationship building and maintaining within those communities. So one of the things, even though we're using the term tribe sourcing as a form of crowdsourcing, it wasn't just everyone contributing. We also paid our narrators. We had financial compensations for them, but just because we gave them monetary compensations, there were still aspects of like, hey, we need to show appreciation outside that. A lot of these people are my relatives, clan-wise, they're part of my community. So I felt the responsibility to continue checking in with them. Cindy and Perry, they were compensated, but they drove quite a long ways to get to the library. So whenever they'd come, I treat them to lunch. I pay for their gas on the way back. Just, you know, they're elders, they're making this effort for us. That also included continued accountability to the community. When COVID-19 hit, Jennifer and Melissa and I put our resources together to put together care packages for our narrators, just to, you know, let them know that we're thinking about them. And also we emphasize to them, if at any point you're uncomfortable with this or sharing your stories or your accounts, you know, please let us know. And, you know, if they want it taken down, we will take it down and we will honor their wishes. And it also includes staying in touch and being able to offer them opportunities to stay involved in the project. And this has included them, you know, incorporating their ideas and inviting them to some of these talks. We had Crystal Littleben come with us to the AMIA conference. We've had Michael Parrish also present at the Orphan Symposium with us too. So we always try to keep them involved with these projects even after the fact. And that's one of the big cornerstones of working within tribal communities and with these aspects of narration. So I think I've used all my time talking about this. So I definitely want to kick it over to Melissa so we can really show where the magic began and see it in action, which is all thanks to Melissa.
Thanks, Rhiannon. So, so my name is Melissa Dahlman. I'm the digital projects manager and the archivist, and I live in Palm Springs, which is still the land of the Agua Caliente band of the Cahuilla Indians. So what you're looking at here is the front page of the website. If you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, you can navigate directly to films per community, or in the uppermost section you can choose other options such as browsing everybody's films at once or reading lesson plans, two of which Rhiannon has developed. And the digital website platform upon which our Tribesourcing website is built is called Merkadu, a content management system co-designed by Kim Kristen, Craig Dietrich, and members of the Marawungu Aboriginal community of Australia, as a grassroots project aiming to empower communities to manage, share, and exchange their digital heritage in culturally relative and ethically minded ways. It's the ethically minded ways that really grabbed our attention. Merkadu literally means dilly bag, or a safe keeping place for sacred materials. Let's see here. And so for the sake of time, in lieu of a live demo, because we want to get to the clips, here's a glimpse of a digital heritage page for one film, The Apache Indian, including how one navigates, how one plays the alternate soundtracks. You start the video, turn off the volume, start the video, start the alternate soundtrack, and then they tend to link up. But as we say, as Rhiannon maybe touched on as well, is that we don't dictate that they keep synchronized with the video. They can say whatever they like. So it varies. And the Merkadu platform has ability to handle diacritics or accent marks that are native to the what it's written, a language is written, is particularly useful. So keywords and dictionary words can be spelled correctly, at least recognizably so. And also in the body of the shot list, we shot list everything so that screen readers can read the content for folks who are blind or sight impaired. And of course, the keywords link through. So if you click on one keyword and there are other films that relate to that topic, then you'll find them. Same with dictionary words, which we don't have the time to talk about, but dictionary words also relate to films. And you can kind of navigate a few different ways through terms, through the films. And quickly, the big check mark with the strike through here at the bottom is another feature that Mercadieu offers. These are called traditional knowledge or TK labels. These were developed by local contexts and are used widely, including by the Smithsonian. And these visual icons you see signal to users that an item on the site may be potentially sensitive content or require additional vetting from the community. And in this case, it's TK non-verified because it indicates that this film has yet to be counter-narrated or reviewed. But we are actually doing a workshop with Desert Kuya folks at the end of the month. And so we anticipate their sign, well, whatever they want to contribute to this, whether it be they sign off on it or want us to hide it, we will do that later, depending on what they say. So also Mercadieu facilitates other unique methods for ethical stewardship to are essential, and you can't actually put a film or anything up without indicating these two things: what community it belongs to and what cultural protocols have been assigned. So for this one, it's from a television show, an episode of a television show called Vagabond from 1958, where they go into the Diné community. And in this case, Michael Parrish, about whom Rhiannon's already spoke, he counter-narrated this. And so he, and I'm sure Rhiannon, perhaps others, weighed in to say that this was okay to be shown publicly. So its protocol is open. And you also see that is attached to the Diné community. And so now when a person comes here, who does it relate to, who signed off on it? And also importantly, we want to make sure that folks know that we pay our narrators. Crowdsourcing usually indicates free labor, student labor or just enthusiasts contributing. And in this case, they of course are paid. So if everyone's in agreement, we will go to a couple of examples here so what I'm going to do is play the original soundtrack and then play the alternate soundtrack that's been recorded. I want you to know that don't think that you've dropped sound. These videos start out with a slate, which is silent for a minute. I kept the slate in because the narrators also were watching this video as it played, and so their narrations often start in sync. So let us listen first to, and this is actually a recreation of what Jennifer was talking about at the beginning. So this is the original, then we'll listen to the alternate, do that again for a couple of others. So let me get to the button here. So again, it's silent for a second.
Once a proud nation of hunters and wolves, but now the poorest of the Southwestern, the Navajo people live in a barren and 1,000 square miles. Most of the land is in Arizona and New Mexico. They are still a nomadic people, frequently moving from place to place on the vast reservation. Wherever their small herd of sheep and goats will find grazing land and be fairly near one of the scarce holes or springs. Their herds are the Navajo's livelihood. They drink the goat milk, and sheep and goats provide all their meat. Their women make rugs and blankets from the wool. Wherever the Navajo decides to settle down for a period of time, he plants a little corn and builds a hogan of heavy pine logs with mud sealing the cracks. The women folk set up their looms near the hogan and work on their rugs and blankets between other chores. The trading post is the Navajo's only link with the outside world. The trader, his best friend. Whether he wants to buy staple foods or sell his surplus sheep or get help for a sick member of his family, the trader will take care of his needs. The Navajos often use their silver belts and other jewelry instead of money if they run out of cash. This has been an accepted custom for many years. The trader simply writes out a ticket for the valuables received.
Okay, so now we will now hear Rhiannon's counter narration. Oops. go. Sorry. This happens sometimes when this doesn't. There we go. This should be Rhiannon's now. There we go.
Yate. This is Rhiannon Sorrell at Saley, Arizona, and I am viewing the film Arts and Crafts of the Southwest Indians, Part 1, The Navajos, which was filmed primarily near Pine Springs in 1940. The title here can be a little misleading because it makes the trades in this film sound like recreational, more of a recreational pastime rather than a way of life that has sustained the Dene since the early 20th century, and it continues to play an important role in contemporary life and economics on the Navajo Nation. As you can see from these opening scenes, the Dene were not village dwelling and lived in small bands spaced apart from each other and often far away from the nearest town. This is where trading posts came in hand. The one shown here is Pine Springs Trading Post, which operated as one of the many community hubs that also function much like a grocery store, an arts and crafts store, a bank, a post office, sometimes even family courts when justices could not, or the people couldn't move to towns to hold court sessions. They also functioned even as mortuaries.
Okay, we discovered that we are running out of time, so we are going to skip the Apache one and just really quickly show you and get past it. Sorry.
Yatahe.
Sorry.
Hello, my name is.
There we go. Then we're going to just play this one really fast. Rhiannon, not to talk about in third person, appeared in this 2020 New Mexico PBS's episode of Colores. And I just want to show you the clip that they used, which actually includes the Slivers, actually Cindy Slivers, speaking in the episode. It's real quick.
At shearing time, relatives and friends gather round to help with the work. They get paid with wool and plenty to eat. Because the Navajo method of earmarking sheep was confusing, they are now branded with black paint at government request. While the wool sack is being filled, it is stomped down in this manner.
What was the feeling you had when you first saw one of these films?
Okay, so there we go. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Let's see here. Oops, stop that. Oh my God, these slides just won't stop doing it. I'm so sorry. There we go. Stop that now. There we go. Just close that. Okay.
Thank you, Melissa. And we are clear at 50 seconds left. So
right.
Dale, we'll turn it over to you. Thanks, team. You're so awesome.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing all of this with us. I think it's really inspiring, and I've invited some students here from UAE who have been IMing me privately about how much they're getting from it as well. What I want to do now is open up for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, Leah, correct me if I'm wrong, they raise their hands, and then we'll connect it with you with audio. And as we're getting ready for questions, I will ask one question to all three of you, or to whoever wants to answer the three. I'm curious if you've gotten, if you've ever shown any of the films with the new audio on top of them to young children, and what their responses are like. Because I was really intrigued with the lesson plans for the students, and I kept thinking, like, what must it be like to have access to this knowledge coming in, particularly if they understand an indigenous language, and then see it over these images.
I think that's a Rhiannon question.
Yeah, I was going to say, right now, I just get feedback. I personally don't go in and be like, check this out and everything. I'm just the narration person and the one who coordinates. But, you know, I've worked a lot with the language revitalization, and I've had grants with creating Navajo language learning resources. And we've had Navajo language teachers saying, I'm using this film in my class now. I'm having my students listen to it. And they've been wanting more and more, because language revitalization is one of the key points of this. They're saying, like, if we want you do more narrations, we would like them to be more in this direction here. And so I'm personally not going in and showing them, but then there are other people from the community that have told me that they're actually showing them in their classrooms and utilizing them that way.
It's fantastic. And that's another issue that I think is important in lots of parts of the world as well. We do have a question from Andrew. Andrew, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, please. And thank you, everyone, for really fascinating work and sharing it with us. My question comes back to something that Jennifer said, but it may well relate to Rhiannon and Melissa too. And it's really around archival precarity and medium obsolescence, and the remarkable story of saving this work or rescuing this work. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, but in a wider context, whether you suspect or know of other treasure troves waiting to be discovered, or the tragic flip side of that, of hearing of archives that have been disposed of.
Well, there are both kinds of stories, certainly. Indiana University has just completed a huge project in preserving 16 millimeter film. And indeed, they have some of the film that our benefactor, Fred McDonald, collected that came out of these schools and libraries, specifically a collection dedicated to documenting Black life from the 20s and 30s forward to the advent of VHS. So, you know, different groups, and Melissa could possibly fill in on this, different groups and entities are committed to preserving 16 millimeter film as a medium. And our professional association, the Association of Moving Image Archivists, has a small gauge film group that works on that. Also on home movie level, you know, which is sometimes 16 millimeter, but sometimes even smaller gauge than that. But of course, things get thrown away. I mean, Home Movie Day is one of the means of redress against ditching the family films, right? And maybe Melissa, you'd like to talk about that?
I would just say that this project certainly has, when it's become apparent to people that this project exists, sometimes people will contact, at least personally, like Oregon Films in Pittsburgh. He said, I've got some films you might be interested in. I've rescued a couple films on eBay, but I was like, we're having that. You know, that's actually a really lovely one that we need to put up that's a home movie. And one time I wrote to Jennifer, I said, it has nothing to do with our particular content, but can we save this? Can we buy this film on eBay? Because it really shouldn't be out there, you know? So we took it and we just tucked it away with our Home Movie Day, our home movie collection here in Palm Springs. But yeah, they turn up and sometimes we go and rescue them and sometimes people are in touch. Sometimes the films they suggest don't really fit our mission statement. So we might suggest they contact another repository. There are rescue jobs happening.
Okay, we have a question from Leah.
This has been really fascinating. I've so enjoyed hearing about your project. And I was thinking a lot about the way that you're foregrounding reciprocity. And I would love to hear more about the way that you conceive of that. But it led me to a somewhat practical question, which is, have any of the folks who are participating in the counter narration thought about creating counter images? I mean, has this led to any kind of filmmaking or sort of amateur kind of recordings to counter the films themselves?
What a great question, Leah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Initially, we had thought that that would happen. And indeed, Fred McDonald, the collector, put everything up on the internet for free download and encouraged people to harvest footage and repurpose it. Once the project came to the University of Arizona, they thought that might not be a good idea and shut down the download component because of potential abuses and disrespectful posting and commentary, as we're all familiar with. So when I teach about this in my classrooms, I encourage students to think about ways in which this footage can be respectfully repurposed. But the ideal place for this, for example, would be the filmmaking program at the Institute for American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, which is an Indigenous fine arts college, right, where pretty much all of the students are Indigenous and well versed in respectful treatment of Indigenous media. And so that would be my thinking about that. But I guess the short answer is no.
Although we didn't get a chance to play it for sake of time, but one of the clips I was going to show was Cheyenne Barefoot, who's a White Mountain, I think, Apache, and Mescalero as well. And she was at UC Santa Cruz as a senior, and she did counter narration as a project and it was like suggested in her class, and we ended up using one of hers. So that was not quite what you're saying, but kind of it made its way into, and she was a media maker. I think she does media making for PBS now, specifically native content.
I was just going to say native TikTok. They're making their own video on TikTok. Maybe not necessarily in response to this, but a lot of stuff is going up on there. Most of it comedy, a lot of it instructional, but there is a lot of debate even within my own community about whether it's appropriate that people should be filming, because some people have started filming ceremonies. Some people have gotten big trouble within their communities for filming seasonal ceremonies, like the Eviches ceremonies, and like these are not supposed to be going up on social media. So it's actually become a big initiative within my institution to educate students about this type of media, I guess you could say Indigenous media literacy, about and responsibility and ethics about putting all of that into digital spaces. It's great for language learning. Our language has never been written before prior to World War, only been written by Franciscan fathers and those researchers that first came in, anthropologists, but otherwise it's not, didn't have its own alphabet. So being able to, digital technologies have been great for language lesson revitalization, but in terms of the culture, there's a lot of sensitivity toward that as well.
And I would just add too, on the question of sort of Indigenous media literacy, this is Holy Week, of course, and here in Southern Arizona, the Yaqui people have a very elaborate Holy Week set of ceremonials, which has never, ever permitted cameras. There was one film made surreptitiously in the 1930s, and it's pretty much back in the archive now, and people can't see it. But with phones and TikTok and so forth, it's becoming a real concern. And the conversation with Indigenous students and within the Yaqui community and the Southern Arizona community at large has been fairly sensitive, but then there are winter visitors here in Southern Arizona who haven't had access to that kind of intercultural understanding. So, and I'm sure, I mean, this is true with insider-outsider interactions around the world, right? That people want images and don't understand the consequences of taking them without permission.
Thank you. Those are, I mean, really, really interesting points. Allison, go ahead.
Hi. It was already kind of answered, but not really. I was thinking about I was looking at the archive. I do some archiving myself, and some of the stuff that I've seen goes back all the way to the 30s, of your stuff goes all the way back to the 30s, and kind of there's some stuff in the 80s and 70s. I was wondering, are you going to expand? Are you trying to expand the archive from like the 80s to 2000s, or are we really focusing on like the true past when things were much worse than they are now, and kind of not reformatting but relearning from that? Or like kind of what's the future? Are we looking more past or more present? Yeah,
that is a great question, Allison. Thank you. We because we pay our narrators, we have enough money to do this region, the Southwest, at this point, and then expanding outward. It's sort of, we have to fundraise to be able to do that. I mean, it would be great to do the Midwest and the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest and so forth, and the Southeast, but golly, we have 460 plus films, and Melissa and I keep buying things on eBay. So that are, really what you might think of as legacy media, right? Moving forward, especially the proliferation of things like TikTok and what people did during quarantine when they, were stuck at home and started making media. I can't even, it just blows my mind to think how we could possibly expand up to date. But thanks for the question.
Did anybody else want to respond to that, or? Okay, Patty, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer, Melissa, and Rhiannon, Anan. This is so stimulating to think about. And I have two questions. One is related to how you're all thinking about if you're going to acquire more material, filmic material for the archives. And in that question, I'm interested in, are you finding in native produced home movies or amateur film? And I'm thinking of this because, of course, this year is the 100th anniversary of 16 millimeter. And I'd like to know a little bit more about what, if you are or not, what the process is. And second question is on the opposite end of exhibition. There's been a lot of work being done with archives around the world to think about new ways of reanimating, revitalizing, revising, resituating, and recalibrating works that were particularly colonial or politically problematic in our current era. And the example that comes to mind are colonialist works, films that the Dutch took in Indonesia. And I know you're all in the archive world, and you're probably very aware of this massive project that's been going on in Indonesia for about 10 years now, of taking those colonialist works and doing new screenings with them within communities, often outside screenings with gamelan music. So stripping the narration off and putting gamelan on. So I use that as an example because it's one that just came to mind, some similar patterns. So, a question of how are you, the other question is, how are you thinking about exhibition, which I know is a treacherous thing to get into right now with post-pandemic issues. But are you thinking of ways of exhibiting, of rethinking? Have there been attempts or is there an interest in using music in certain kinds of ways with this? So, I know it's kind of going in two directions, acquisition and exhibition, but I'm really curious how these 4 R's would impact that kind of thinking. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Patty, and for the invitation to participate at all. Gosh, so acquisition is complicated. I mean, I could spend every penny I've ever earned and everything I will ever earn to continue building up our collection. And the NEH doesn't really fund acquisition so much as dealing with held assets that we already have. So we don't have a business plan because we're not a business, right? We're an educational asset. So acquisition is a little bit, how shall I say, opportunistic. And people, as Melissa said, people do offer us films from time to time, and that's wonderful. In terms of Native produced media in Indigenous communities, you know, part of what this project is to create community subsets of the larger digital site, and McAdoo supports that. And then each community would have its own site to upload whatever they wanted to. There are a number of archiving projects going on in Indigenous communities around the Southwest, and I'm sure in other parts of the country as well. And you know, everybody's got tribal council video and everybody's got powwow video because that's pretty much what everybody shoots. But and then there are, you know, more interesting things going on. Our project, our ethos is to facilitate the return of control to the communities, and what they want to do with the site and what they want to do with their locally produced media is up to them. It's not something that we actively pursue, we facilitate, right? Let's see, the other part, oh, the gamelan, right. One of the things that we're committed to in this project, and it's a little bit different than the Indonesia project in this sense, is that we don't strip off the original narration. It is always there, and the two are side by side, or 3 or 4. You know, there can be plural responses to any given film, but we don't remove the original narration because we feel, and our elders and our community advisors have underscored this, it's important for everybody, but especially kids going forward, to see and hear what the original narrations were like. Otherwise, they're not going to know what the fuss was about, right? So stripping it is a kind of sanitizing. It's like taking down statues, right? So that future generations who never knew about that wouldn't understand what the struggle was about. Not sure I answered your question, and maybe my colleagues can do better.
I mean, I certainly go, there's no, unless a Native person comes and presents to you a home movie that they shot, when you've come upon home movies in the wild, in the field, you never know who shot these. And usually when you find them, they document encounters, you know, between the whites and then white tourists and the Native communities that they're wandering through. And so where someone, and actually there was a young Kuya and Kupeno, a person, student that I met recently, and she actually did want to start a home movie archive, perhaps using MercaDo as a platform to start encouraging the kind of recording, collecting of the representation and having people speak back to them in our own project. So, you know, I wouldn't, you know, I'd be like, can we have yours? Of course not. She had to decide if she wants, you know, how to proceed with the films that they find. But I wouldn't know unless someone were to present it to us if it was Native.
Right. And I think for me, even though I'm the narrator coordinator here, I'm very insistent on letting the community tell me what they want to be done with it. So, you know, we have talked about doing screenings, and showcasing, but at the same time, that was right when the pandemic hit, and it hit tribal communities really hard. And so that was kind of like a scrapped idea. But at the same time, there was also kind of like, well, what would be the, what would the narrators want to do with it? And a lot of them are just like, I don't really care about trying to get any kind of big recognition. I just want this to be within the community. And a lot of the community people, they can get to it straight from their own computers. So there hasn't been a real big demand of doing showcases, but I always tell Jennifer, we can just play this film in an IHS waiting room and just take the audio off, and we'll get some amazing stories from there. So, you know, showcasing for me has always been just like, hey, check this out, and take the audio off, and then they'll be like, oh, they'll start talking and sharing and everything. And sometimes they'll be like, hey, you want to share that with us? Did you like to record that? And we got a few that way. So I don't know that screening has been really a big issue here, more as it has been perpetuating that knowledge within our own communities and our classrooms.
And I should add that next summer we're going, what month is this? April. This summer we're going at the end of the summer to Navajo Nation fairs, which draw from across southwestern Indian country, and showing films, but not really on a big screen. This will be sort of iPad based, and people can hook in and record narrations sort of on site. Not exactly a recording booth, but we're really looking forward to that, because I think it's going to be a little bit like Rhiannon was saying. You can just put it up on the health service screens in the waiting room and see what you get. I hope people are going to be excited about responding at the fairs.
Right.
I mean,
Oh,
sorry.
So go ahead, Melissa, go ahead.
No, I was just saying the one exception that Rhiannon spoke about, or I mean, we did have, there was a composite that came to EMEA, but the orphans was sort of an exception. Orphan Film Symposium was an exception that we made about screening a film, because we could have followed by Michael Parrish and Rhiannon in conversation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done it. So there's the kind of ethics of screening these materials in a different context, outer context of the narrative with the accompanying narration.
Thank you for that. And that actually answered my question about, because I was going to ask you a question and the fairs didn't answer. But I'm really happy, Amalia, you've come here and she's posted some information in the chat. And I was going to ask her, poke her to speak, but she volunteered anyway. So I'm so happy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for organizing this. We're at a time when it's critical to be thinking about the obsolescence of media and the deterioration of analog media in every way, shape, or form, particularly ethnic media. It's something that is a big concern, I feel, of the Indigenous filmmaking community itself, right? So I'm actually in a couple groups dealing with either specific collections or specific gaps in collections. So I had a couple questions. One on the decision to use Mukurtu. I understand that it is a platform that allows certain things, but at the same time, what's stopping communities from just going ahead and doing the work themselves in whatever structure, shape, and language they find most adequate? And how can communities sort of control their own technology and not be dependent on a third party? And I think that really links into the idea of Indigenous sovereignty and media sovereignty. That's top of mind with this work. And then regarding the exhibition, I think that falls upon curatorial responsibility of the sourcing of your materials and a filmmaker's responsibility. In Indigenous media in Latin America, all kinds of archival work are appearing to tell the history, but using it as archival material with a new narrative. So I'm wondering about how are you evaluating the use of Mukurtu and whether that is something that is a given and forever, like a superhighway, or can you move off and do something else? And is there some kind of process for evaluation and rethinking along the way? And then finally, just a little caveat on the idea of, there's sort of this crystallized idea of everything has to be saved, right? That's a super Western idea as well. So sometimes we have this provocation, which is this original recording But in some places, you know, you could do a re-recording and a re-recording on top of that and a different recording. You could just use that as a mirror for reflection and not have to necessarily obsessively capture every single use of this footage. And there's also limited capacity with which we can do that. So mainly that question about how you're gonna measure success, or what are you gonna do with the evaluation of the project. Thank you.
We're very close on time, so if I could ask the participants just to speak very concisely.
Jennifer, do you want to discuss, you know, the putting ourselves out of business?
Well, right. Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Right. Why Mukurtu? It was the most inclusive platform I knew about at the time we started looking for a way to facilitate this digitally. And right, the goal is seriously to put ourselves out of business, to hand the community pages to the communities, to invite their local control, and to ultimately step away. And at that point, I guess the value of Mukurtu will be self-evident, because it will either sink or swim.
And sure, you can take this off. I mean, we're doing this workshop again at the end of the month. And what I say to them is, you already have a perfectly fine WordPress website on which you can add videos and stuff. And so you needn't pivot and use Mukurtu. We're just doing this workshop in case this becomes a way for you to facilitate what, you know, Rhiannon has done at Dana College about using it as a language revitalization tool and those sorts of things. So here it is, use it or not, this is how we use it, you know, and I can help you if you want help, basically. But yeah, we want to turn this project over to another, you know,
on that note,
facility.
I think you said that exactly, what a segue into what I was going to say. There's nothing stopping anybody from doing this, you know. That's up to communities. And I always put it back on tribal communities themselves. Like, do you want to do this? You take advantage of it. If not, then, you know, don't complain. I didn't say that. We keep talking about self-determination. Well, then self-determine. And I always put it back on the communities that way. It is difficult to the media. I know the tools. I'm really grateful to Melissa for everything that she does for us and everything, and because I could not do what she does. I could not build anything from scratch myself. So I can see why a lot of people don't want to or deal with it. So we're happy to be a part of it. But the idea is I challenge communities themselves. Like, what do you want to do about it? It is your stuff. It is your media. Do something about it. You know, I'll help you. I'll help you however I can. And it kind of goes back to this idea, like what you said about not having to save everything. I think with Indigenous knowledge is we got to be self-responsible ourselves. The Navajo, we have sand paintings, and the sand paintings are used in ceremonies, and they're not meant to be preserved. They're not meant to be held in eternity. They're wiped. They're very intricate pieces of art, but they're wiped out at the end. And we can't just say, well, we need to preserve it. Well, we need to keep preserve. What we need to do is pass on that knowledge of sand painting and its purposes and its meaning and what it's for to next. But if the next generation is going to be like not interested in it, then who's to really blame them? Who's responsible for carrying on that forward? So I always kind of turn it on ourselves. Like, when we say self-determination and sovereignty, like, what do we really mean by that? And what are we doing on our part to facilitate that?
All right, thank you, everyone. This is fascinating questions that get into archival, political, aesthetic, technological, et cetera, et cetera. We have a couple more minutes, so I wanted to ask if each of the participants would like to just say any final thoughts as succinctly as possible, because we're very close to the end of time.
Rhiannon, you go first.
Oh, no, you go. I'm still thinking.
Or like a takeaway from the discussion, takeaway from the discussion.
Well, I would just underscore to anyone who's interested in Indigenous media and engaging with it in any way, read the protocols first, build relationships with the communities if you're not an insider, and proceed with your ears and your heart open and your mouth closed.
Rhiannon?
I keep going back to this, holding space for these discussions, and And there's another aspect of it that Navajos always talk about is Tahoe, which means it's sloganized, like it's up to you. It's up to you to decide if you want to undertake this work and move these projects forward, and to be a part of it, people being part of the solution and engaging with that. So yeah.
And I'll just leave on a nerdy note that if you do want to pursue a Mercadoo project, Mercadoo has really, really great support pages. So you can, it really, they help you start from the very beginning. So don't think you can't do it. You can.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for this. And I think, Leah, I'm going to pass it back to you.
I would just like to invite everybody to take a moment to unmute themselves and applaud our speakers for this fantastic presentation today.
Wow, thank you so much. We are just so happy and honored to be included in FLEF and to be showcased in the exhibition. It's such a great way to share our project and let people know what we're doing. And one tiny little thing I wanted to add, because this is an environmental film festival, is that some of these films are really useful ways to observe and document climate change. So if you haven't thought about investigating that aspect of them, please take a look.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, I thought